All right, hello everyone. Today's session, we're looking at the chapter on the Middle Ages, the years roughly 600 CE to 1450, a time during which enslavement was largely eradicated from at least the Indo-European world. It's a sort of a separate question what was going on in the New World, which of course David got to in his in Dawn of Everything. But in this case, the Middle Ages is a period that conventionally or historically has been understood as a period of economic stagnation because of the decline of bullion as currency, and that scholars have falsely taken the reduction in use of currency, bullion currency, as an indication of economic decline. Seen from another perspective, if bullion is the result of enslavement and bullion is no longer circulating as heavily, then by that logic, enslavement has also reduced. And so seen from another perspective, the Middle Ages is actually a time of tremendous innovation, technological innovation, especially centered in the region of the Middle East, where there were Muslim rulers who kept separate the sphere of the market, the sphere of exchange, and the sphere of sovereignty. And so this made for opportunities, possibilities for innovation and cultural fluorescence, because people were not burdened by the demands of material production for the sake of material production. During this time, as enslavement retreated, it's not that economic behaviors retreated, it's that they took on more interpersonal forms where rather than promises of bullion, well, I mean, there were still promises of bullion that were at the heart of credit arrangements, but credit arrangements increasingly took the form of notarial arrangements, just arrangements that were recorded on slips of paper, etc. So this allows for the rise of a kind of manorial feudal system that, though it didn't have the kind of violence associated with it as earlier imperial conquest did, in not having that as a means to an end, people were able to develop intellectually, socially, and culturally in ways that previously hadn't been materially available or socially available. So the Middle Ages in David's work is, instead of a time of decline, it's actually a time of innovation that will help set the stage for capitalism. And without giving too much away, his argument about capitalism will look less at the changes in class relations going on in the old world and look more at just the opportunities that the stakes of a new international market, the way that a new international market allowed particular players with access to capital, it allowed them new ways of arbitraging that those opportunities, that they were able to gamble in new ways. And so the world became, after 1492, sort of a global casino in a new way that prior to 1492 was not possible. And yet it was a time of innovation and cultural achievement. So let me pause there and hear from all of you, your takeaways on this very meaty chapter.
So one of the things that I found really fascinating was that in both the Eastern Mediterranean, so in the Islamic world, and also in China, they had market systems that were enabled without excesses of competition. That in the Muslim world, the premise was that not only were markets positive, but that markets were a sign of cooperativeness, that they stem from and originate in the ability of people to cooperate with each other, to specialize, and therefore optimize both their social and economic conditions. And in China, merchants were still seen as easily corrupted, but that was tapped by coming to terms with them in a way, saying that yes, you can make money on the work that you've done. That's fair, but you can't be excessive. And so both of them had well-established markets that lasted for centuries, without the trappings of a competitive, excessively competitive European style. Which comes after 1492, because as in the Middle Ages, there were guilds that were democratically run, and until you got the the late Middle Ages, where the burghers and the royalties kind of take over, it was a fairly democratic society. It had also evils as well. I don't want to make it utopian, but with respect to debt relationships, it seemed to exist very differently from what we had after capitalism recreated the definition of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I've found that the takeaway that you could be heavily pro-market and anti-capitalist very thought-provoking and valuable. And also, I thought the discussion of the dynamics of wealth hoarding in the Buddhist monasteries in China was, and the way that played out in the society was really interesting.
Yeah, I had never, before reading this, I'd never thought of Buddhism as a particularly merchant-centric religion or belief system. And he really demonstrates how closely related it is. And when you then try to synthesize that with Confucianism, which is a deliberate effort to keep merchants in a structurally inferior position, it makes for some interesting civilizational ways of understanding that part of the world that I think most people certainly trained from a Eurocentric standpoint would never really think to consider, because again, the idea that one could be pro-market and anti-capitalist is still pretty difficult for people to make sense of, I think, in this country, the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph, is your hand up?
I would like to better understand how exactly that worked in practice. I'm trying to find the section and I don't know exactly where it was, but where the thing that you mentioned a moment ago, Stephen, where the merchants were looked upon in China like soldiers, which were drawn to serve in the military because of a love of violence. As individuals, they weren't viewed as, they were inherently not good people, but could be made to serve society as a whole, in a particular structure, and merchants were viewed in the similar light, and that the Confucian bureaucracy viewed merchants as parasites in a sense, and that somehow that ideology caused the bureaucracy to not side with would-be capitalists, which always existed. But I'd like to better understand, how did they actually, I mean, there must have been more than, I don't know, I imagine there must have been more than just a general common sense about being anti-capitalist. There must have been some other way that prevented capitalists from teaming up with the state. I don't know. I don't remember a section talked about that in the book.
So I know that in the Arab world that there were deliberate efforts made by authorities to prevent merchants from having the kind of overlapping authority in the state structure. And so, you know, it's my understanding that it was a similar kind of process in China, where the officials who were part of the state and those who were the merchants, that they made, I mean, to use the terminology that Graeber develops elsewhere, they basically considered each other taboo enough that for them to come together was, you know, would have been taboo. And so there was this this creative refusal that kept being rehearsed or reiterated. And so there's a tendency then to put measures in place to prevent merchants and state authorities from having the kind of power that they can when they fuse, because then it's basically, there's no escape from that power. And so you know, and this gets to kind of David's entire intellectual project, which is these were civilizations that practiced a level of prefigurative politics that Western scholars have completely lost sight of because of this social evolutionist argument about feudalism, hunter-gatherers leading to civilization, leading to urbanization, etc., capitalism, feudalism, capitalism, communism.
So my understanding is that in Europe, when the military lords started to move into the cities and establish residence in those cities, and at the same time, the trade guild, the guild that would run the, you know, kind of the trade between cities, started to flex their muscle. That's what you're saying, Stephen, is that perhaps the fusion of those two groups led to in a sense, the Renaissance, where you have very powerful trade guilds running both the military and the government and the market. I haven't read the chapter on the Renaissance yet, so and the age of capitalism. So I don't know if David takes up that.
Yeah, he says that, you know, what distinguishes the period after 1450 is that the bankers the marketeers, the profiteers, and the aristocracy, the rulers, the sovereignty fuse into one. And that's been the case since 1492. Those developments, he argues, are already in place. And of course, you know, if you think of he's arguing that, you know, they're already in place by the 1300s. You know, if you think of the Medicis and the kind of power that they had as both merchants, connected to bankers, connected to royal houses of sovereignty. But what he's doing is expanding the scope, the temporal scope, so widely that he's showing that what the Medicis did was take advantage of some opportunities where state and market were not fused. They were able to fuse them, and that when they fused, that historically has been understood as the innovation that is capitalism, when really all it is just another rehearsing of state authorities and market authorities incestuously, you know, joining and limiting opportunities for anyone who isn't part of their team. And so that was able to diminish from 600 CE to 1450 CE, because it had extended to such a point where people were walking away from the demands that were being placed on them because of the inherent contradictions of a Boolean system. Because ultimately what he's getting at is, you know, there's always going to be a discrepancy if people use a logic of exchange, redemption, salvation, to understand what is essentially an existential question. And, you know, our existence need not be understood through the logic of exchange. And yet there are these times, these big phases in history, epochs in history, where precisely that logic fuses. And it isn't inevitable. It's just that we've come to understand human history falsely as this kind of narrative since 1300 that we now like mistake for all of human history.
How are you doing? Good.
Was someone wanting to chime in?
Just to add a simple point, just a simple observation. Kropotkin makes a lot of the same observations in mutual aid, which I know Graeber, I'm pretty sure Graeber was well familiar with. But he also talks about that transition between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance in similar terms. I think Graeber is much more detailed and drills down much deeper into what that transition meant and how it's related to debt and currency. But the observation is in Kropotkin and then gets suppressed through much of the 20th century, which is interesting.
What about, I don't know, I have read this a couple of times, but I don't remember that Graeber says an awful lot about the religious aspect of this era. I mean, obviously he's talking about Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and so on. I suppose Confucianism as well. But it's like how you could see that if you're seeing the development into the Middle Ages in those terms. I think that you were saying that people walked away, as it were, from the kind of classical era societies. It's also like, what was the beginning or the triumphs of these religions, was it something that in itself was people trying to get away from the previous system, or was it a method that the ruling classes were using to deal with what people were doing? I don't know. That, to me, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think at a certain stage, the kind of logic of exchange that requires the this infinite reproduction of materialism, at a certain point, it's going to hit a threshold and it's going to be untenable. And so then actors, I think, try to find ways of navigating that system as it becomes less and less tenable. And then out of that dislocation then arise new innovations and new ways of resolving those contradictions. So yeah, I think it works in a variety of ways where this isn't just being driven by the masses, but it's also as elites are, or state makers, marketeers are trying to manage their own worlds in ways that they can try to stay on top.
Stephen mentioned Kropotkin, but and that was really useful because when I read this book, I'd never looked at history this way before, and I mean, it's only 10 years old, but I don't think there's really a development of these ideas, or at least please tell me about it if there is, apart from this group, maybe.
Well, there is a growing number of scholars who are testing his framework out on different periods in time. And, at least the works that I've seen, they really give a really strong endorsement to understanding the big sweeps of history. This, especially as related to debt. I mean, in particular, the relation of debt, that debt is ultimately a moral system, and humans, in creating meaning, all we're really doing is creating value systems or, moral systems. And why is it that we think that our existence ought to be understood in logics of exchange? Because that there's nothing inevitable or even natural about that. And yet, even the idea of the transmigration of soul, there's kind of an exchange. There's a lot of exchange to that as well. And and that's an idea that doesn't that doesn't sound exactly materialistic, and yet if there is a transmigration of the soul, then David's take on materialism is that mental work, imagination, is itself material, and that it's been kind of falsely understood, or it's not been amplified enough where it's understood in material ways. But if we think of human behavior as actions with intent, then we can call it immaterial labor, but it's a form of interpretive labor that deserves to be measured and factored into our understandings of change over time.
But once you start to represent exchanges as a kind of transaction, what David Graeber seems to say in the end of the chapter, which is really brilliant, is how that gets converted into a means of maintaining hierarchy or establishing hierarchy. And so maybe the real contrast isn't between materialism and something that's non-material, but between systems that tend to enforce or create hierarchy and systems that tend to act against those hierarchies. And that seems to be what's being established as we move from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, is that the debt systems are reaffirming the unequal relationships between the lender and the borrower.
Yeah, I think you've hit on it perfectly, because it really, you're absolutely right that exchange doesn't need to imply hierarchy, and yet it can be used in a way that creates and then reproduces hierarchy. And so then what is the difference? When is exchange not hierarchy? Well, I mean, exchange, even as a gift, there's a hierarchy there because of the obligation. But if we think of exchange in ways that try to get us beyond just automatic hierarchy, then, you know, David mentions this. He says that that there are exchanges that are transactions where there's a transaction and you walk away, and that's where Homo economicus behaves.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other kinds of exchanges, like gifts, are relational exchanges where under a transaction, everyone is supposed to be made better off, even though there might be a winner and a loser from one's perspective. But in a relational exchange, both people are being made simultaneously in that act of relating to one another. What's fascinating is why, and this is where David brings this up in his more theoretical work on value. The question that Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, asked is, why then are humans so prone to relating to people through an object that is not the person? Why does it require a third, this object? Because then it becomes basically parallel play, which then means developmentally we haven't really gotten past a stage of play that's associated with toddlers. Well, maybe young, you know, infants, let's say. And so, and that is a fascinating question. Why do humans need this third thing to fixate on, a fetish? Well, precisely because if someone owns that third object or can claim it after it's produced and say it's mine, they've just established hierarchy. And so in this logic, in this system, that kind of fetishism is inherently immature. And so any kind of material accumulation of fetish is just infancy, according to Piaget, Turner, Solons, Graeber. Yeah, you know, the framework is the moral, the moral cosmology is sound, and it holds up developmentally as well. What hasn't happened is that synthesis of using this framework to then go back and revisit history. And, you know, that's why I still am, you know, every day pained by the loss, because there's a whole research agenda that for him probably would have been fairly easy to do, and that for the rest of us, it's you know, it's a lot of hard work piecing together the thinking.
There's one interesting recent example in the UK with the people who broke into people's homes to install the prepay meters. And that seems to have brought out a general sense of moral condemnation in the nation, which is quite an interesting. I don't know. I was thinking maybe it's a sign we're moving back into. This is unlikely, just purely imaginative idea. Moving back into what they were doing at the beginning of the Middle Ages in some ways.
I think you see that in the reactions to the student debt crisis in the US, that the thought of some sort of jubilee is met with just horror and anger, and really represents a direct maintenance of hierarchy, I think. And I was wondering, it's not something I know a whole lot about, but I wondered if anybody had thoughts on what Stephen was saying about the nature of gifts as opposed to transactions. I think, and it's not something I really understand or know, but in Sharia finance, I think debt obligations are structured as a sequence of exchanges that are mutually beneficial. I think that's kind of how they get around the usury issues. I don't know a lot about it, but I'm curious if anyone does.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know anything about that topic. So yeah, if anyone does, I'd love to hear.
That would be interesting, actually, for the future work of the Graeber Institute with the Global South students or researchers to ask them exactly that question, to provide an examples from their, or like to expand on the examples of their own culture that would complement that ideas. Because most of the people who now is applying for research, it's people from the Western universities that will keep the same, roll the same ball. But that will be cool to involve a totally new group of people from African countries and Latin America and so on.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one of the things that David said early on in the book, you know, in the first, I don't know, it's probably like page 10 or something, where he says one of the great universals of humankind is this universal hatred of people who are money lenders, and especially the ones who lend it at usurious rates. And so there is, you know, there aren't, a lot of people would have us believe that humans across cultures don't have a lot that unite them. I think they might have more. It's just that there are some authorities who don't want us to draw the conclusions about where we might have things in common. Yeah, that would be a wonderful, because one of the things, I don't know this at all, but you know, there are a lot of developments going on with microloans and microfinancing that, you know, some of them are deliberately using the structures of capitalism to try to alleviate poverty. And so, you know, one wonders to what extent that can be done. But there are other innovations going on that are definitely grassroots efforts that, you know, I think that David's work with the Brain Trust, you know, I think I would imagine he had tremendous interest in it. I just haven't seen where he has written about it. I mean, maybe in some interviews that he gave to journalists. some of the debates about microfinance. I don't know if he commented on that much.
Yeah, that's all a future research. Like, have to go
So-
through.
In this context, I wonder if it's worth thinking about the contrast he makes between the market systems in the Muslim world versus the other market systems. And that premise of mutual aid being the foundation of markets, and the moral foundation for markets seems to me to be really important. Even within gift exchanges, David Graeber has that wonderful story about the French explorer in the Arctic, who is given, after a bad day's hunt, is given lots of meat by a neighbor, and he says thank you, and the neighbor says, "Don't thank me. This is not a gift. This is essentially mutual aid, and if we start with gifts, before you know it, we're going to get into slavery." And because we now have obligations to each other and so forth. And so it was a very sophisticated argument against transactional exchanges, and for mutual aid as the foundation for exchanges. And I wonder if exploring that theme, and how that's understood today, both within Muslim societies, and their relationship, or the way in which they think about merchants today and business, but also just going back to those sources and maybe thinking about how they translate in today's world, would be helpful. If you start with competition as your foundation for the market, you're going to make very different kinds of moral decisions.
Yeah, and especially if you start from the assumption that there's a finite number of resources and an infinitely expanding number of would-be consumers. Yeah, it makes it really easy to do some distasteful and unsavory things to people.
Right, but if your premise is mutual aid, you're led in an entirely different direction.
That's something that really struck me. Maybe you all already knew this, but just the fact that Islam was condemning or not allowing usury and promoting this kind of mutual aid ideas, and then also like the early Christians, the same kind of stuff. It just is so different than today's culture. It's so hard to imagine. It's so amazing. And then also somehow it struck me too, like in China, they were saying there was rebellions like every 2 hours or whatnot. It kind of like reminded me of what Steven was saying earlier about the prefigurative politics. Like in a way, it seems like there must have been like a massive engaged amount of people like thinking about this problem and trying to avoid it and actively like fighting against it in a way. Coming off like the intensities of the axial age, I'm sure is what helped spur it.
Joseph, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would like to hear you speak a little bit more about what you mean by prefigurative politics. I read what you wrote in the chat, but I'd like to hear more about that.
I mean, Nika might be the better one. Nika, do you have anything to say about prefigurative politics?
Oh, not really.
No, okay. I mean, I'm happy to I mean, keeping in mind that this is just my take. So, and Mark might have something. If Simona were here, I mean, she would be in this group. She'd be the go-to person. So it's basically the idea that instead of just assuming that we're all competitors out for our own, individual ends. We should think of ourselves as a body with individual needs, but where the diversity of the group can be embedded, and there's a collective whole. So there's both a multitude and a molecule. There's both like the individual and the group. That, of course, is an inherent tension, because if you are an individual and you're in a group, at some point the individual starts and stops, and the group starts and stops. So there's always something that distinguishes the individual from the group. And those differences should be allowed for in a way where there's mutual aid. Well, if I have my own individual needs that I'm pursuing, at some point that's going to bump up against the multitude, the collective. Well, we can expect that to happen. And so if we expect that to happen, we should already have in place some means that allow us to work through that process, because what typically happens well, not typically, what happens every time in vanguard politics, which is sort of a vanguard politics can be prefigurative, but the difference between vanguard prefigurative politics is you've got a group, a dedicated cadre of the most revolutionary. And so these would be like, the radical elite or the radical chic, who are really the vanguard making the decisions, and then the rest of us just kind of follow along. Well, that's inherently authoritarian, and you're basically just reproducing the very flaws of the system that you led the revolution to combat. So you account for that by building in alternate means or additional means or just means of any kind, so that the means don't become the direct ends, and that or so that the ends don't justify the means, and you've always got means in place that allow for the collaborative, mutually defined and reached means, because there is no end in prefigurative politics. There's only the means. Because if there were an ends, that's not mutual aid, that's someone else's politics. And so there's always a defining of community, but where you're deliberately or prefiguratively defining community in ways that allows at every turn the diversity of community to be there, so that there are mechanisms put in place prefiguratively that prevent the concentration of power in the hands of the few. I would argue, and I think David would agree, that the only time this has ever happened is when women are in charge. And that even then, I'm sorry, Mark?
The Commune.
Yeah.
The French
exactly.
Commune.
Right. Like it can happen. And it does, until you've got the megalomaniac, misogynistic people who are in it for their own ends, who can then, all it takes is a few people, and then you start conspiring, and you're going through the process all over again. And so that's been the danger of Marxist politics, is because Marxism is like a mode of analysis, you can basically find people who can claim to know how to apply that mode better than others. Whereas anarchism, because it's an ethics of practice, the ones who are best at it are, and I mean, if David were alive, I would ask him this question, but I think Nika probably can give me the answer. David had ample opportunities to become an even bigger celebrity than he became, but he wasn't going to let that happen, because if he were to then use that celebrity for his own ends, he's no longer an anarchist. And so he would, I think, deliberately not dominate the airspace, because to dominate the airspace is to risk becoming a Stalinist, a tanky. Is that accurate, Nika?
I don't know how to answer. Like, he was, he didn't feel even as a celebrity, he was kind of, yeah, he was just doing his stuff. He was never, yeah, he was never in a situation when he even presented a choice to take over, or maybe he was avoiding the situations, wasn't interested. It's also because he was constantly busy with his own stuff and his own research. Like, he was never pursuing something that, would lead, like, okay, I know the answer and I want everybody to make it work. So he was always pursuing new things. Like, when he first time have like this huge book tour during after bullshit jobs, and everybody wants him to go and do the same like shtick over and over again. And also during the COVID, people wanted to take an endless interviews. That's probably how you become a celebrity. If you're constantly repeating yourself, then people remember you, because it's very easy. It's complicated to digest for the crowd. So you have to be repetitory. But David would just like reply to these people, okay, read the book. I already said everything I wanted to say. I'm not a parrot to repeat it. So I think he was just, because he was trying to live as he's already free. That was a recipe. It wasn't done for, doing some kind of trying to live to some rules. It's quite opposite. It's just because he wanted to be free himself. I don't know.
So we should resist Graeberism. We should not become Graeberists.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if any of you in here who sort of weren't at the beginning of the Museum of Care, but Simona Ferlini is one of our dear comrades, I guess, and she early on wrote an article called "Against Graeberianism," because there was a worry from us that that we would. I mean, and I'm guilty of it. I will use Graeberian as an adjective or a noun, even worse. And in my family, they know, like, I'll say things like, well, if we think of this in Graeberian terms, and they basically just know that is like, I'm going to be doing some structural ethnography right now, or like I'm going to be trying to identify the creative refusal that someone in a privileged position is able to make. And so it's just a shorthand for like an ethnographic method that that Graeber did not invent. He would say, no, this is Terence Turner, his doctoral advisor. And then Turner would say, no, this isn't me, this is Jean Piaget. And when you read Turner's own stuff that finally came out, finally was published after he died, basically the bibliography is just, Piaget, like, because he's found a framework that got completely overshadowed by French structuralism rather than Swiss structuralism, which is what Turner and Piaget were trying to do. But notice, like, I'm already guilty of the very things that we want to avoid, which is associating certain ways of thinking with individuals. David would be the first one to say, there's no monastic mind. There's only collective mind. What I think one of the things that was so beautiful about David is he knew exactly what was universal mind and what was his, and he didn't need to take credit for what was his, because if you're already free, you don't need to be shackled by the desire of celebrity. As someone who's not famous, I wish I could be so strong.
I have been calling myself a Graeberite. I don't know if that's slightly better. It's just a way of getting people interested, you know, who haven't heard about it and so on. Because with the Debt and the Dawn, those two books to me, it's just a beginning of something, and an incredibly fertile beginning. And lots of my friends have taken up, certainly with the Dawn of Everything, a lot of my friends have taken up reading it. I'm finding it harder to get them to read Debt, but hopefully they will get on to, I mean, they're both pretty big books.
If we go back to what Nico was saying, acting as if you were, no, living as if you were free. I mean, that was the title that he wanted for the Democracy Project book and was not allowed to use that. But I mean, that summarizes the prefigurative politics, I think, precisely.
And that's exactly what would kind of supposed to be a policy of the brain trust, the new brain trust, that is like kind of distinguish between petitioning the government and, you know, acting as you're already free. That's mean direct action. Yeah, and that's how brain trust was born on the ask of Extinction Rebellion. That's basically vanguardist politics, exactly as Steve described it. So it's was set up by the person who calculated how much civil disobedience should be, like 3 points, like, I don't know, 5% of population have to perform civil disobedience, and then it should be clear demand, and the government will have to obey. And that's the whole movement, like a big movement was built on that. But then it turned out that the language of violence in a way, or, you know, do that or else, that's the best language that first government understands. And then the state is really good at that, much better than any activist or anybody else. So that's actually, yeah, for now it leads to like really cruel laws, new laws in the UK and throughout Europe. And so new brain trust would follow up the original David's politics that is you guys described very well.
Is there a link to that, Nika?
David Graeber at that institute. It's a really
Okay.
two projects. It's a brain trust and archive, so very easy to find.
So it's under that main website. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
Joseph,
So-
is your hand up again? Oh yeah, it is. Please.
Yes. So if I understand what you're saying about prefigurative politics, it's a matter of recognizing the ways in which individual and collective needs can conflict, and considering actions that can be taken, not rigid policies, but practices that can be put in place to resolve those conflicts in non-dominating ways.
I put in the chat a reference to Maurice Mitchell's writings on that topic in a very practical sense. At least in the US, there's a number of I guess political movements that are that support climate justice, and they are and social justice. They are in a dynamic that's kind of tearing themselves apart. And he is Maurice Mitchell is the founder of the Family Working Party, Working Families Party, and it's the article is quite interesting from a practical standpoint about what you need to look out for in this conflict, in this tension between the individual and the group, and individuals that try to, in various ways, try to dominate the group using various kinds of communication forms, and how they can be abused to create hierarchies, and how you need to establish certain kinds of guidelines against it. So, so if you're, I haven't related it to prefigurative politics. I need to look into that more, but I think they're talking about the same issue. And Mitchell approaches it from a very practical standpoint as an organizer.
I'm reminded of a section from Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. She writes, "There is no conflict between the individual and the social instincts any more than there is between the heart and the lungs. The one the receptacle of a precious life essence, the other the repository of the element that keeps the essence pure and strong. The individual is the heart of society, conserving the essence of social life. Society is the lungs which are distributing the element to keep the life essence, that is, the individual, pure and strong."
I just throw in a comment. Sorry I'm late, so maybe this is already been discussed. I was fascinated with the bit where they cover the sort of Islamic or the Middle East area credit structures and some of the arguments, and they find the same arguments as Adam Smith. Did you already talk about that? That was pretty fascinating to me, that literally Adam Smith had cribbed all of his stuff from 10th century Islamic intellectuals on how the economy should work and how trade should work and why an open market is a good idea. But what's most fascinating is that the author, David Graeber, kind of notes that even though they're saying roughly the same thing, in one case, they've tucked it into a structure which is argues for the improvement of the economy, and a market and trading system is for the common good. You know, albeit there was a fairly critical opinion on what that common good was. It wasn't 100%. And on the other hand, they've tied it into an idea of individuals who are much more, I don't care about you, you don't care about me. We're just simply making a transaction, and there isn't a community here that grounds our transaction, not a kind of common ethic of person to person. So it's interesting that the same ideas of a market could be, in some sense, put into two different territories, or made the territory of two different ideologies. So you see a whole space where an open market can be thought of in a different way.
Hey, Stas, would you like to speak?
Hey, yeah. One of insights from this chapter in the very end was like it's small, but it blows up if you think about it. The difference between industrial capitalism that started in 15th century versus everything that was and everything that could be, like Roman and the Phoenician empires were like, you can think of them as capitalist, but they weren't like our capitalism. And a specific example of Graeber is why Islam merchants did not create capitalism. The difference he identifies is idea of corporation. And well, it is a simple and a very short statement in this book, but if you go through value theory and importance of actions and his work on fetish, maybe I'm going on a tangent here, but the way I see it, well, first insight is that humans ended up in a relationship of debt with immortal humans. Mortal humans ending up with relationship of interest bearing in uterus competition with the mortal humans. And obviously you cannot win this competition. You will necessarily succumb to being the part of one or another corporation because, well, the logic of debt will always win on their side. If you take it a step further, then all the nations are basically corporations. That is, nations from legal perspective can enter relationships of debt with other immortal beings, with other angels. And if a nation takes infinite loan that just spirals out of control, well, nation being like a mortal entity doesn't, like, it will never die, it cannot default. What you really do, you just shove people into the nation. So they have to take obligation of a nation, and you basically shove people into relationship of a infinite debt, but by forcing them to be members of corporation. And if you take it the next step further into work on fetishes, corporations are basically the idols. Corporation is a fetish that replaces the fetish of God. So the way all the humanistic religions been suppressing this Boolean violence and slavery is by elevating one fetish above all else and saying that all other fetishes are just idols and heresy and not allowed. Basically, they've been declaring monopoly for magical services. And by allowing to create a legal fiction of corporation, merchants broke this monopoly and allowed to create a new idols. But in a sense, it is a revival because fetish isn't some corrupt thing or broken thing in our head. Existence of fetish is how we know that society exists. This third thing that mediates connection between two people that can preserve history of relationship because it has durability beyond memory of individual is how we know that people actually form society, by observing them creating fetishes. As African merchants were observing these people taking beads and leaves and stuff and making fetishes out of them. Every time two people, strangers, come in for some kind of relationship, they would create a symbol of this relationship. And symbol of relationship would need to be material, something kind of eye-catchy thing. Like for them, it was beads, whatever. So the freedom to create your own fetish, like the conclusion, The freedom to create your own fetish is a necessary ingredient for social creativity. In a sense, humanistic religions were trying to suppress excessive creativity that was just spiraling out into war, like into slavery and conquest. And this monopoly was then broken down by allowing new kinds of fetishes, new kinds of social creativity. But then merchants deployed monopoly of like only corporations are now valid fetishes, valid idols. So this is very fragmented, and I'm gonna stop talking now.
Thank you for that. I think that was a really nice analysis where, I mean, that was value theory applied to the nation state. Yeah, I thank you for that. That's a nice way of kind of summing up. I'm looking to see if there might be any other thoughts. I want to be aware of the time. We're at 15 past the hour, so this might be a good time to end this session. So thank you everyone for coming. We will go on in our next session to the chapter on capitalism, which I was not let down by the chapter, but I was actually expecting a more, I guess, a more specific, like, definition of capitalism. And the definition that he uses, it makes good sense and it works, and I don't have any sort of issue with it. It just was a lot looser of a definition than I was expecting, but I think that's what gives it some analytical power, because if we just start with the idea of debt as an imaginary relationship with the gods, with the cosmos, as Stas just nicely illustrated, then there's really nothing unique about capitalism as capitalism. It's more what's unique about an international system of enslavement that allows the bodies of a particular group of people to be indebted to some promises that will reshape the world economy. So that's for next session. I look forward to seeing all of you. Any last comments, Nika?
Yeah, I wanted to say that maybe after we finish this reading group, we can have several sessions inviting partners, conversational partners, and handling a dialogue. Like Kit Hart today sent me his text about 5,000, his comments on 5,000 years of that. And I was thinking it would be interesting over reading book now, start to collect names of the people who we wanted to invite. And then maybe we can do a couple of sessions with that. For example, I already got agreement of the person who, I forgot his name, who was an editor of the book that you, Steve, quoted, that was published in Oxford.
Oh yeah, the John Weiss
Yeah.
Miller. Weiss Muller.
Yeah. Also, Roberts, I wouldn't say the names because I will make them wrong,
Yeah.
but it's some person who, like David introduced me when we were in the conference about kings in Oxford, who also mentioned the 9th chapter that we can also probably invite. And if anybody has another ideas, please share them. And we can make a couple of kind of final session with conversations of people who are kind of researching the debt or did some work along the side.
Sounds good. Ed, Joseph, did you?
Joseph's,
Yeah, Joseph.
I just wanted to briefly say, I think I remember a couple of weeks ago, Nika, you mentioned the possibility of spending 2 book club meetings on this chapter on the Middle Ages, and I wanted to present that as an idea. If that's interesting to anybody, I would be happy to go either way.
Yeah, that, right, we did say that. I mean, maybe there's still, I mean, we really didn't do, I don't feel like we did justice to the Islamic world at all. So if we want to continue on that, the capitalism chapter, I do think is kind of short. Like, that's what I mean. Like, I found it surprisingly short. I was expecting, like, finally, the Graeber's take on capitalism, and it was, satisfying, but I was expecting like a real kind of like, like political economy takedown. And it's, no, this is a moral universe. And so there's, some moral promises that get made. We might be able to combine both, since the capitalism chapter, how about we, like a chapter 10, 11 hybrid, and then people go with what inspires them. Does that work? All right. Ed, any last thing?
Yes.
hand is
So,
still up. Yes.
is it once a month? It's my first meeting, so.
Oh, yeah. So we have a schedule on the website, if you visit there. And then our next session is, I believe, March 2nd.
March the 2nd.
Yeah. Oh, yes, March the 2nd.
Okay.
Right. Today's the 16th. So March the 2nd is our next.
And if anybody, if you know anybody, or any of you know somebody in Oxford, which is where I live, that you'd like to put me in touch with, that would be very helpful to me.
Yeah, that's good to know. When I make my, I'm going to look you up when I'm in England.
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of set up a kind of Graeber society in Oxford, and so I'm looking for contacts, and I just thought I'd mention it in case anybody came up with a but never mind. Bear it in mind.
All right. Yes. I mean, there are Graeber groups forming everywhere.
Good.
Okay. It's nice seeing all of you, and I hope to see you again on the 22nd. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.